Hi, John. Now, we've had a lot of discussion about Trojan Horse over the years, and people have said all sorts of things. And today, I just wanted to get at some of the myths around Trojan Horse and ask you, as one of the real experts in the field, as to where the truth lies in this situation. So, let's start with the situation that people have said that the trials around Trojan Horse, when they collapsed, because obviously lots of teachers were taken, were expected to be sacked over this. 100, I think, was talked about, and then we got down to 15, and then when they went to trial, most of those trials collapsed. Now, people have said in the right-wing press, especially, that those trials collapsed on technicalities, and it wasn't really major, and that these people were really guilty. Now, can you let us know whether that's the case or not?
Well, the trials collapsed on the technicality that the government lawyers were involved in misconduct. They'd said throughout the process that they didn't have transcripts and material from the Clark report, and yet what happened was that they had prepared the witness statements for the court on the basis of transcripts, editing the transcripts that had been given to the Clark report, redrafting them, putting additional material in, and then having them signed by the witnesses. So the things that were presented in the Clark and then leaked into the press as allegations were revised in the course of preparing for the court, and under the requirements of disclosure, all the Clark material that was being used by the lawyers for the prosecution should have been made available for the defense. They didn't make it available.
So what you're saying, essentially, if you don't mind me coming in, is that the prosecution lawyers were saying that they didn't have access to the Clark information, that they weren't using it in the prosecution, and in fact, all along they had been using it to prepare the prosecution case.
Yes.
So it sounds like a bit of a serious technicality, if it is a technicality.
Yes, I mean, it is in fact clear misconduct, but because all unused material, that is material unused by the prosecution, should be made available to the defense. So that's, if you like, the first issue of misconduct, the failure to properly disclose. But also, they had misled the panel.
So before you carry on, and the defense didn't have access to that material as well.
No.
So not only had they claimed that they weren't using this when they were using it, it's actually material that the defense didn't have and should have had. Yeah. And hence, they were a complete disadvantage to prepare their case.
Yes.
Okay, so sorry, let's carry on.
Yeah, and then when they're asked about it at different points in the case, and they give complete assurances that they have disclosed all material, that there was a strict, what they call structural division maintained between the part of the Department for Education that had the transcripts and the part that was responsible for preparing material.
And this wasn't the case.
And this was not the case. No.
And they had said that in court continuously.
They had said that in court continuously, because one of the issues that would come up if the case had proceeded, so if a verdict had been discovered. So imagine that the verdict that those in the press believe should have taken place. That is, they would have been found guilty because they were guilty and only got off on a technicality. Well, there's no reason why the case could not have proceeded. All the failure to disclose became known during the course of the trial. It would have been really difficult for the lawyers and the prosecution, but the case was still ongoing, and therefore the material was now disclosed and could therefore be considered during the course of the trial. So the panel finds a reason to discontinue the case, because if they proceed, they either have to find the teachers guilty or not guilty. If they find them guilty, they know that it will go to a High Court appeal, and they are likely to be under really serious criticism and censure within the High Court.
Within the High Court. Okay, excellent. Let's move on to another area of contention in this whole thing. Look, people have said, okay, Trojan Horse letter was a hoax. Everyone agrees now it was a hoax. And, we've had so many people look into it, the West Midlands Police, Department for Education. Everybody's agreed that the actual letter itself is a hoax. But really, there is something going on here. There must have been, and one of the things that people have picked up on is that there were safeguarding issues at the school. Now, can you, in your opinion, having looked at all this over the years, etc., were there safeguarding issues at Parkview School?
I don't believe there were. And for me, the serious issue about the various inquiries and reports was that they established no benchmarks against which the schools should be judged. So, for example, if you're going to make a criticism that they failed to implement a prevent duty, you need to ask, well, what was the prevent duty at the time, and how was it being
Did it exist at the time, the prevent duty?
It didn't exist as a duty, and as far as most schools were concerned, they thought that it was covered under another duty they had, and that was a duty to promote community cohesion. Under that duty was set up by the Labour government and was set up in relation to concerns around extremism and so on. So there was good reason for schools to think that that duty and prevent were similar. And the Department for Education in 2011 did conduct an inquiry into how schools understood the prevent duty, and it discovered that most of them thought it was associated with the duty to promote community cohesion, and 58% of schools had no one at all trained in prevent.
So what percentage did you just say?
58%.
So 58% of schools at the time had nobody trained at prevent in those schools, according to the Department for Education.
According to the Department for Education's own...
So if Parkview School didn't have regular prevent training, they wouldn't have been in isolation. They wouldn't have been even in a minority.
That would be the case, but they did have someone trained in prevent. It was just determined that the amount of prevent consideration they gave was insufficient. But they give no statement of what sufficient would be.
So where are these safeguarding allegations coming from? I mean, because when people talk about safeguarding, we're thinking that, there must be extremism at the school, that there must be child protection issues, that there must be something of this nature going on. Was there anything serious of this nature at Parkview School?
Nothing at all. And indeed, the one major issue that gets into the newspapers about and is even represented within the Select Committee in the House of Commons, reflecting on the Trojan Horse. So one instance of extremism is the supposed recording of a jihadi video at the school. That's continually brought up until it's dropped. And the reason why it's dropped, it's initially going to be part of the case against the teachers. It's dropped, and it's dropped because it's discovered that the recording was a panorama program. It had been requested by West Midlands Police, and it would been requested by West Midlands Police in order to go into the school and give a talk about issues of radicalisation. So not only was it not an example of extremism, it was an example of the school being concerned about
this consistent one example of extremism that was found at the school where this extremist video had been shown was actually a panorama documentary that had been requested by the police to be shown as part of training around extremism.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
And in fact, the school had really good relationships with the police. It had sort of close connections through one of the people who gets accused within the process is a former police officer. So the school was concerned about issues like knife crime, drugs, and so on, and regarded success within the school as child protection. So what I would put it to people is that the incredible educational achievement of the school, the way in which the school brought the parents into the school and had them, committed to the success of the school, was actually child protection.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I've got another question for you. So another one of the accusations that's put is that, okay, there wasn't extremism, there wasn't a threat of that nature, but there was a plot of some type, because there was all of these people who knew each other, who were all involved in education, and therefore there must have been some sort of influencing of each other and some sort of nefarious plot type activity that was taking place.
Well, that's where I think both the Kershaw report and the Clark report are seriously flawed. So they didn't consider other explanations for the connections between people. So imagine you've got an incredibly successful school. An incredibly successful school. It's in the top 14% of all schools in the country. It had previously been identified as one of the worst schools in the country back in the 1990s. And it goes through a process of improvement. And its improvement is in the context of circumstances that would normally be associated with lack of success within a school. So if you were interested in the education of Muslim pupils, or indeed pupils from any background, you would beat a path to Parkview School to find out what they were doing, to understand the basis of their success. And not only would you imagine that local teachers, local governors, and so on would be interested in learning about the school, you would imagine too the Department for Education would be keen. Yes.
As they did.
Yes.
And Michael Wilshaw.
Michael Wilshaw. And also encourage the school to become an academy in order to become a multi-academy trust, in order to take over other schools, in order to...
So they were taking over other schools?
They were taking over other schools as part of the government's academies programme. So you go through the Clark report.
So is that nefarious, that they're taking over other schools?
Well, it's only nefarious if you think that Michael Gove was part of the plot, because he has to sign off every takeover. And one presumes that he signs off the takeover of the schools on the basis of the recommendation of his officials, the due diligence that those officials have done. And indeed, it's only happened because the school has been identified as outstanding. It is asked to take over schools. So it's not that Tahir Alam and the others are seeking to take over schools. Their expertise is being sought, and they are asked to take over other schools. The plan was for up to 10 schools to be part of the Parkview Academy Trust.
Whose plan?
The Department for Education.
So the department, this was being encouraged by the department?
It was being encouraged by the department. It was part of their accelerated academies program. So if you're asking, well, why might there have been such an extreme reaction? Let's use the language of extreme in the context of the reaction of the Department for Education. Why might there be such an extreme reaction from the Department of Education? Is they're faced with a media scandal that is pointing directly at their academies program. If there is something wrong that is happening, it's happening because of the action of the Department for Education. I am firmly of the view that there was nothing wrong happening, that it was quite correct and proper for the officials at the Department for Education to try and involve Parkview in other schools and be part of a broader school improvement program. But the Department for Education manages to keep itself out of any discussion. Gove draws up terms of reference for Clark that don't involve any examination of the role of the Department for Education. And it's only when the material is disclosed. So ask those who say, well, it was a technicality, to say, well, when the material from the Clark Review is disclosed, we discover that there's lots of statements from people, from members of the Department for Education, indicating that they saw no problem with what was happening at Parkview, that they were at all the meetings where that are reported in Kershaw, where Kershaw says, I don't understand why somebody from Parkview has turned up for this meeting. They've turned up together with officials from the Department for Education.
Thank you. So essentially what you're saying, John, is that the plot, if there's a plot at all, to take over schools is something that is being encouraged by, that is being organized by the Department for Education and signed off by Michael Gove himself. Thank you for that, John. I have one other important question for you that comes up in the context of Trojan Horse. People say, okay, there might not have been extremism. Maybe there's not a plot because this is part of the Department for Education plan for academization and multi-academy trust, etc. But definitely there was Islamization, that Tahir Alam and that his team at Parkview were Islamizing what was a secular school. What do you have to say to that, John?
Well, there is no such thing as a secular school. All schools are required to have religious education and compulsory acts of daily worship, primarily of a Christian kind. That's not faith schools, that's all schools. So there's no such thing as a secular school. In a school which is 98.8% Muslim, it clearly isn't appropriate to have...
So, sorry, just to stop you there, John, before you carry on. Mm-hmm. All schools, all state schools in England and Wales, I presume, are forced to have, by law, a daily act of collective worship.
Yeah.
And so... I mean, yeah, sorry,
well, let's not say forced, because the reason why I don't say forced, because let's say it's determined by due process of but the parliamentary...
The law states that they should have.
The law states that they should. A lot of them don't. So a lot of schools don't bother with it. So you could say they're not forced because schools don't bother, and it doesn't look as if schools that don't bother are subject to...
but the law states they should.
The law states that they should. Now, obviously, if your pupil intake is not from a Christian background or Christian heritage, having Christian worship isn't appropriate. And the law recognizes that that for religious minorities, that might be a problem, and therefore parents can withdraw their children from daily acts of collective worship. But you would lose the whole purpose of collective worship and school assemblies if 98.9% of the school withdrew from collective worship. So that allows you to have a determination for worship other than Christian Islamic worship. Now I'm going to put to you something else. Imagine that many people in England are not religious. So they don't care about whether or not there's collective worship in schools. And on balance, they probably think that there shouldn't be, given that they're not religious themselves. But if you're going to require a determination, if you're going to apply for a determination for Islamic worship, you've not applied in order to ignore worship. You've applied because you believe in what the legislation sets out, that it is good for the moral and spiritual development of children.